Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome to Pakistan in Perspective, a special series examining the state of minority and human rights in Pakistan from a historical, legal, and philosophical perspective. In our last program, we discussed the question of religion and whether a state can define who is or is not a Muslim for purposes of the law. And we also discussed the particular discrimination against the Ahmadiyya Muslim community and how this discrimination is unique and distinct from other minority groups. Today's program explores more closely the special case of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in Pakistan. What is the specific evidence of discrimination and persecution against Ahmadis, and how have anti-minority laws, anti-Ahmadi laws, been used to stifle and indeed criminalize the activities of the Ahmadi community? And joining me in the studio to discuss these matters are two special guests from the United Kingdom. On my right is Lord Eric Avebury, who is a member of the House of Lords since 1971 and also Vice Chair of the UK Parliamentary Human Rights Group. It's an honor and privilege to have you here, Lord Avebury. And on my left here is Mr. Lionel Blackman, who is a solicitor advocate and current chairman of the Solicitors International Human Rights Group. It's an honor and privilege to have you here, Mr. Blackman. So gentlemen, the international community has taken note of the recent assassinations of two very prominent Pakistani governmental officials and vocal proponents of minority rights. And that is Punjab Governor Salman Taseer and Minorities Affairs Minister Shahbaz Bhatti, both of whom were courageous advocates for minority rights and both of whom tragically and sadly were assassinated. And those assassinations have sent ripples in the international community, particularly here in the West, and raised questions and concerns about the future of minorities and minority rights in Pakistan. In light of those political events, I wanted to turn first to you, Lord Avebury, and just your reactions and impressions about the state of Pakistan today.
Well, what I find particularly alarming about the assassinations you mentioned is that the large body of public opinion seems to be suggesting that the criminal who murdered Taseer should be exonerated. And I find that so incomprehensible that people should actually believe that a murderer who commits this horrible crime in open public view should nevertheless be exonerated. And if that turns out to be a largely held view, I despair of Pakistan. I really do think, that the moderates and the people who believe in the rule of law are being steadily eroded, and that the extreme opinions which this represents are gaining ground to an extent which is absolutely horrifying and alarming to the general peaceful population of Pakistan.
And Mr. Blackman, the causes that these gentlemen stood for, which in many ways led to their assassination, stemmed from their advocacy work for minorities, for their human rights work, and specifically championing the rights of those who have been called out by law in Pakistan, and their activities have been regulated and indeed criminalized. So in light of what they stood for, and given recent events, what are your impressions about what these events mean for the future of Pakistan in terms of their current anti-minority laws?
Well, I think that there is some cause, in fact, for hope. I believe that there is a growing improvement in the liberal mind. For example, the Prime Minister communicating to the United Nations just as recently as the 22nd of September the withdrawal of reservations that had been applied by Pakistan when it ratified in April 2010 the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That may be perhaps just symbolic. There's more work to be done on the ground to realise the significance of that withdrawal of the reservation, particularly Article 18, relating to religious freedom and freedom of conscience and belief. But it's an important step in the right direction. And as more liberal-minded people stand up against the, if we could call them the absolutists, the sort of people that would justify and garland the assassin of the former governor of Punjab, there is hope, and it needs to be supported by the international community in every way. And there is an opportunity to do so in the following critical 6 months, when submissions are required for Pakistan's next universal periodic review towards the end of 2012.
We'll be discussing in more detail the ICCPR and specifically how Pakistan's current laws perhaps are in violation of those international legal commitments a bit later in the program. Lord Avery, I wanted to ask, you've been a vocal advocate and supporter of human rights in the House of Lords, outspoken about human rights abuses abroad. What prompted your interest in the issue of minority and human rights generally?
Well, I've been, first of all, founder and chair of the Parliamentary Human Rights Group from 1976 until 1997, and that led me to consider minority rights in a great many different countries, not just in Pakistan. And I do believe it is one of the fundamental challenges that face all human rights campaigners, is that when you look across the world, you find that minorities are universally discriminated against. It's a curious function of human behavior that somehow people fear and dislike minorities and are prepared to do horrible things to them, either in the name of religion or for some political reason, none of which, of course, have any validity in human rights terms, but which stem from some aberration in the human mind. And I think it is one of the fundamental tasks of human rights campaigners to expose the treatment of minorities wherever it impacts on the lives of human beings, and to try and get people to conform with universal values as regards the improvement of human rights of minorities.
And speaking of Pakistan, and obviously you have special expertise and you've had leadership on this issue of human rights abuses in Pakistan, and turning to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, when did you first learn or come to learn of the persecution of Ahmadis in particular?
Well, it goes back a long time. I mean, I was in Pakistan when I had the opportunity of visiting Benazir Bhutto and asking her to repeal the blasphemy laws, and being told, well, you see, it's all very difficult. I mean, she didn't say that she didn't wish to repeal the blasphemy laws, but that she was up against forces in the community which made it difficult for her to enact the legislation necessary for those repeals. Again, when I met President Musharraf, he was trying to water down the blasphemy laws and say that they should only be brought into operation by a senior official of the police. But as soon as he'd said that at a large public meeting that I attended, there was a huge outcry, and he was forced to backtrack on it. So, as long as I can remember, and this goes back to the days of Zia-ul-Haq, there's always been a substantial section of opinion in Pakistan which saw that the blasphemy laws were evil and should be repealed, but they were up against these forces of popular opinion which they didn't dare to confront.
And we know that this issue of the anti-blasphemy laws has really been in effect for over 25 years. And the blasphemy law itself, Section 295C, applies broadly to not just minority groups, which include the Ahmadis and which include Christians, non-Muslims, but also Muslims, and that the bare majority of arrests under these laws are actually of Muslims, so that the impact of the laws are felt a lot more broadly than just simply to minority groups. And the question I have for you, Lord Avebury, is with respect to the Ahmadi community, because we know that the blasphemy law does exist, but that is just one particular law, but there are specific provisions in Pakistan's penal code that target the actual activities of the Ahmadi community and mention those activities by name. What are your impressions of those laws?
Well, I think it's particularly wicked that Ahmadis are not allowed to call themselves Muslims. And I think, that is certainly a violation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 18, is it, Lionel? And so I think, that will certainly be a subject for examination now that Pakistan has removed its reservation to the ICCPR. But when you look at the situation of Ahmadis, and I'm sure Lionel will have more to say on this later in the programme, it's not a matter of one particular aspect of discrimination, but it's across the board. And the ostracisation of the community, the boycotting of Ahmadi businesses, the confinement of Ahmadis to certain occupations and their exclusion from all important offices of state. And so the discrimination against the Ahmadi community is a universal one, and one which is backed by fundamentalists who are prepared to raise the question of Ahmadi boycotting at every opportunity. In fact, there's an organisation which is dedicated to the suppression of the Ahmadi community, the Khatme Nabuat, which is a very powerful and obscene violator of human rights of the Ahmadi community.
And Mr. Blackman, you have spent some time in Pakistan. When did you first learn of the conditions, particular conditions of the Ahmadis there?
Well, to be perfectly honest, it was shortly before my invitation to join the delegation that I began my research. And that perhaps reflects that there is more to be done to raise the awareness of the British public as to the plight of the Ahmadiyya community in Pakistan, that someone in my position wasn't particularly well aware of the situation. And I went on the delegation in early 2010. And to my mind, I would describe there being, in a sense, 3 levels at which there is discrimination. With or without the discriminatory laws, there will be a problem with the sermons of the absolutists that incite hatred and incite, ultimately, murder that takes place. There is the, if you like, the petty discrimination, where the fact that the Ahmadiyya community are ostracised is then a very convenient basis for a jealous neighbour to make a false accusation. And then thirdly, of course, there is the state actors themselves that either through a sense of discrimination that they possess in their own hearts, or because of fear of consequences for failing to act on the basis of accusations made falsely or just out of pettiness, they behave in a discriminatory way. And certainly the last 2 forms are ultimately underpinned by the existence of the law that discriminates against Ahmadiyyas. And that should and can be dealt with, and ought to be dealt with if the representative, the High Commissioner to the United Nations of Pakistan, at the last Universal Periodic Review said that those laws would be reviewed. And so that's a statement on which Pakistan needs to be held to account at the next review next year.
And Lord Avebury, you mentioned about the Parliament Human Rights Group and the work they've done and your leadership on the subject. And you also were instrumental in 2 fact-finding missions that were conducted by the group. And I wanted to get into details about those because they're very illuminating. The first was a mission that was specifically geared towards understanding the situation of Ahmadis in their headquarters in Pakistan, a town that they refer to as Rabwa, but that has been renamed effectively as Chenab Nagar. And the second investigation, and that was in 2006, and the report subsequently the year later. And in 2010, this 9 or 10-day mission to more broadly focus on religious extremism, to which Mr. Blackman also participated. What prompted you to commission each of these missions?
Well, the first of the missions was prompted by the fact that in our asylum system, the UK Borders Agency, the body that was responsible for enforcement of the law on asylum, was saying that Ahmadis could relocate within Pakistan to the city of Rabwa, which you mentioned, because that was controlled by the Ahmadis and they were perfectly safe from persecution there. So the first mission went to Rabwa. It comprehensively refuted the idea that this was a safe place for Ahmadis and that they were in some way immune from the persecution that their brothers suffered in the rest of Pakistan. And so that had been removed as an argument which the UKBA could adduce in the asylum tribunals to show that Ahmadis could be returned to Pakistan because there was always somewhere safe for them to go within the city of Rabwa.
And on that report, and that report from a lawyer's perspective, as an advocate myself, and many of my colleagues have used the findings of that report in court in the United States in arguing asylum cases, has had tremendous impact. And the notion that that internal relocation will somehow lessen the severity of the persecution is quite belied by a finding that the persecution is especially pernicious and severe in the largest concentrated city for Ahmadis in Pakistan. So we very much commend those findings. The individuals and the lawyers, and I understand there were several who went to Rabwa in Pakistan, what specifically, if you recall some examples, what specifically did they observe that they reported that would contradict the notion that Rabwa would be safer than other locations?
Well, to put it broadly, I mean, Rabwa is a city under siege. I mean, the restrictions on the activities of people in Rabwa are very tight. The operations that they can conduct within the city are closely controlled, and they can't have businesses and universities and all the things that you would expect in a normal city are very tightly restricted and prevented. So the idea that Rabwa was a normal city where people could conduct their own business was completely wrong and had to be rebutted from the point of view of the immigration tribunals. And then the second, can I come on to the second?
Yes, I was just asking you about this second fact-finding mission in 2010.
Well, I mean, having done the mission to Rabwa, we thought in the Parliamentary Human Rights Group that this had to be set in context of what was happening to the Ahmadiyya community in the rest of Pakistan. What was the nature of the phenomenon that caused this discrimination against them? And one thing to add to what Lionel was saying earlier on is the total impunity which is enjoyed by people who commit the most ghastly offences against individual members of the Ahmadiyya community. The murders, the discrimination, the incitement to hatred, the open incitement to murder, which you find in the literature of the Khatme Nabuat, who are circulating pamphlets calling the members of the Ahmadiyya community wajibul qatl, which means worthy to be killed. If that's not incitement to murder, I don't know what is. But it has the effect of causing extremists to say we must do this in the name of our religion. We must kill people because that is the way that we go to paradise, as they're told by the people who are inciting these crimes. So, I mean, I do think that an additional feature of the discrimination, which is utterly evil and needs to be confronted, although it seldom is the total impunity of the people who commit these offences.
And Mr. Blackman, so one of the observations of those who would defend the current regime, blasphemy regime in Pakistan, is that the kinds of activities that Lord Avery has just illuminated and discussed, the kind of religious extremism, the kind of rhetoric, the kind of sectarian strife, incitement to hatred, is just that. It is sectarian. It is private. It is not state-sponsored. It is not institutionalized. You spent several days in Pakistan, particularly Karachi, and met with Ahmadis. Is that true?
Well, I think those that make those kind of statements are overlooking the importance of the institutional mechanisms that effectively endorse acts of discrimination. Well, we know the law to begin with is discriminatory, but then the application of that law, where there otherwise would be a discretion in a truly liberal democracy, is lacking. Accusations are taken on face value, people are arrested, they are detained for months, sometimes years, on just an allegation before ultimately at the High Court bail may be granted. And so it is an institutional issue and must be addressed at that level, not just in terms of the wider debate between the absolutists and the liberals in society, whether religious or otherwise.
And legally speaking, it's true, is it not, that an affirmative act by the state is, of course, pernicious and problematic. And in Pakistan's case, we do have actual laws that specifically target a minority group, which is rather unique, even for an Islamic state. But even state inaction, that is the failure to act in the face of evidence of persecution, yes. The idea of acting with impunity, the idea of failing to protect those who are most susceptible, who are most vulnerable, that too is problematic from a legal perspective, is it not?
It is recognized by Pakistan that it is problematic. I was reading the observations made by a number of states at the 2008 Universal Periodic Review, and it was Denmark that took up that very point, that in many mosques, mainstream Muslim mosques throughout the land, mullahs are making inflammatory speeches. It effectively constitutes incitement to hatred, which is against another law in the penal code. Why isn't it being enforced? The response of Pakistan is it is a huge problem and very difficult for the state to tackle in a society as large and diffuse as Pakistan. But again, something to hold Pakistan to account at the next review. I'm sorry I keep going on about it, but there is this opportunity, and it's in the next 6 months that submission should be finalised for its actual review next year. Again, the officials of Pakistan said that that would be something they would be working on. And so the question is, what have they done?
Right. The key document that is used to initiate a criminal case under the blasphemy law is is the FIR. Lord Avery, I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because really that, in many ways, is the source of a lot of the problem. Some of the recent attempts to reform, even during President Musharraf's time, was to make it more difficult for that report to move along the process, or to have oversight from a senior police officer, for instance. What are your impressions of the way that these cases are prosecuted, and is there potential for change?
I think is that, as you say, I mean, Musharraf did dip his toe in the water in the sense that he was intending to provide that the FIR had to be endorsed by a senior officer of police, and then he had to rapidly retract that when it caused a huge outcry. So I mean, even that minor amendment to the law was not acceptable to the vast majority of the fundamentalists, and they were the ones that called the tune. I mean, it's always astonishing to me that although the extremists have very little voting strength when it comes to elections in Pakistan, they wield an influence that's out of all proportion to their numbers. And part of that is, I think, due to intimidation, and that people are frightened of the extremists. They don't dare to confront them. And you see that in terms of the response to the atrocities that are committed by the...
Rather difficult to change, to effectuate change when even the slightest change is met with such resistance. Indeed, the assassinations of these two officials were done only because they spoke about against these laws, not really even instituting reforms.
But there's a more deep-seated problem that we face in Pakistan that underlies this phenomenon of impunity, and that is that in the mosques and the madrasas, a certain brand of Islam is being preached, which depends on the ideology of Maududi and Qutb, who were trying to explain that the world was divided into two halves, Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, and these were fundamentally in conflict with one another, and the struggle would lead in the end to the supremacy of Islam, which would spread over the whole globe, which is so contrary to the vision of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, where all religions would coexist and would live in peaceful harmony with each other, that you can't believe that Pakistan has changed from that ideal to the present system, where the Salafists, the extremists, are wielding such enormous ideological influence.
Well, certainly a steady deterioration from where Pakistan was, what it was founded upon to what it is today. Mr. Blackman, one of the very troubling aspects of the situation of Ahmadis is that it really comes down to the issue of self-identification, does it not? That Ahmadis, they can't identify themselves as Muslim by virtue of the Second Amendment to the Constitution. And really that makes their situation different and tragic.
Effective denial of the Ahmadis' right to vote, I think, is a very serious matter, and one which no doubt will be raised in the Universal Periodic Review, because the way in which this is done, by saying that the Ahmadis have got to denounce their own religion in order to get onto the electoral roll, is again a violation of Article 18 and would have to come under review. And I think, you know, one of the problems that we face is that the international community doesn't sufficiently press Pakistan to remedy these violations of human rights that exist in their law. We're told by our ministers that they raise the matters with their Pakistani counterparts, but there's no sanctions against Pakistan when they refuse to listen to the voices of the international community. And I think that's a very serious issue that we need to consider, you know, when we're dealing with our own ministers, and same in the United States, that you'll find that yes, the State Department do raise these things with the Pakistanis, but what do they do when the Pakistanis say that they're not going to lift a finger to correct the defects in their law which prevent the Ahmadis from voting, for example?
Well, it's a very interesting question. It's a question of the day, and it remains to be seen whether real electoral reform and real reform of the blasphemy laws can take place in the current climate in Pakistan. Well, it was just a pleasure and delight to have both of you here on the program. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. It went very fast. I'd like to thank you again for joining us and sharing your thoughts. Our special series on Pakistan in Perspective continues. Join us for next week's program, in which we take a comprehensive and thorough look into Pakistan's anti-minority and blasphemy laws from a legal perspective. Thank you very much.